What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So I want to talk about Kamaru Usman and how the last few weeks of fights have really bolstered his legacy, and in a very strange way, and in a way that's actually like contrary to what you typically want, but it's worked out really well for him because of the specific conditions involved. And so what I'm referring to is the fact that Usman has outlasted the people that replaced him. And by that, I mean he has outlasted Leon Edwards and he has outlasted Belal Muhammad. Now, he only fought one of those guys, but they're sort of the narrowly defined generation that came after him, because he, of course, had his title reign, he had his defenses. He then lost to Edwards. He lost the trilogy fight to Edwards. Edwards defended again against Covington, and then Edwards lost to Belal. And so that's kind of like the post-Usman era. It's Edwards and Belal. Usman, has the fight with Khamzat and then has this big hiatus. And typically what you want is for the people that you fight to do well. So if you beat someone, you want them to go on to do well because it just makes your win age all the better. And if you lose to them, you also want them to go on and do well because it makes your loss to them not look so bad. If you're Ryan Bader and you lose to John Jones when you're both contenders, and then John Jones goes on to be the greatest light heavyweight of all time, it's not such a bad look. So in both cases, you just want the guys you fight to do well, typically. And had Usman not come back, had Usman not returned from his hiatus and defeated Joaquin Buckley, then these losses that Edwards and Belal have experienced lately, Edwards getting submitted by Brady, then getting knocked out by Praches, and now Belal getting beaten by Gary, these losses would not look great for Usman. They wouldn't hurt his legacy too bad or anything, but he would prefer the opposite. He would prefer Edwards to win those two fights. He would prefer Belal to win that fight. Belal to just beat frickin' JDM in the first place and keep his belt. But because you want the guys that come after you, you want the guys you fought, and he only fought Edwards. He didn't fight Belal, but they're kind of from the same era. You want those guys to keep doing well. You want those guys to go off and keep winning. If those guys could all beat the next generation, if they could beat the Pracheses and the Garys, that looks good indirectly for Usman. Now, the reason, though, it looks good for him that they've lost is because he beat Buckley. Because by doing that, by him passing his test, by him beating the young guy, by him taking out the young challenger who everyone was picking to beat him, by him doing that, he has outlasted Edwards and Belal. And it's funny because he's actually the oldest of the three. He's 38. He was 38 when he fought Buckley. Belal is pretty old too. He's 37. Edwards is only 34, but that's still getting up there. But again, as the oldest of the three, Usman passed his test. The other two did not. And that means he's effectively won. He's won long term over those guys because not only was he the better fighter, the better champion, the better win streak, etc., but he's just fucking outlasted them. And he's sitting in a good spot. He's a ranked dude. He, Islam Makhachev, was floating his name out there as a potential title defense. That's a good spot to be in. Whereas someone like Edwards is fighting for his job at this point. And Belal should probably just retire because he's, again, he's losing and he's getting up there in age and, what's he going to do? So Usman has done something that I can't even think of another example of, because typically you see one of two stories. You either see the champion have his opponents go on to do very well, and then that reflects well on him, or you see the champion have his opponents go on to do poorly, and then that reflects very poorly on him. And of course, like I've been saying, Usman's had the opposite. He's had the guy who beat him and then the guy who beat that guy go on to do badly, and it reflects well on Usman. So, let's give some examples here. Just sticking with the welterweight division, Tyron Woodley had a similar thing happen where the guys he was fighting went on to lose, and it just looked terrible for him. Because at the height of Woodley's reign, people were, considering him the second best welterweight of all time. They were saying he was better than Matt Hughes, and they were saying he was pretty close to GSP. Some people were suggesting that had he beat Usman, had he defended his belt against Usman, that he would have been the welterweight GOAT. Now, of course, that would have been horseshit, but people were throwing that out there. What happened in reality is within 1 month, in March of 2019, Usman lost to, or excuse me, Woodley lost to Usman and didn't just lose but got dominated. And in that same month, Darren Till got knocked out by Jorge Masvidal, and Stephen Thompson got knocked out by Anthony Pettis. Now, if you don't know, Tyron Woodley had 4 title retentions. And I say retentions because one of those fights was a draw, which still goes to him, so he gets to keep the belt. And then the other 3 were wins. But those 4 fights were against 3 dudes. Damian Maia, who also was losing at this point because he went on to lose to Covington and lose to Usman. And then the other 2 were the guys I mentioned. It was Stephen Thompson and it was Darren Till. And so to have, have all of the guys you defended your belt against just be losing, and to have 2 of them get knocked out the same month that you lost your belt, and to have one of them be Stephen Thompson getting knocked out by former lightweight and featherweight Anthony Pettis, whom no one was picking to win, that just, all of a sudden you went from on the verge of being possibly the welterweight GOAT to just having your whole fucking legacy thrown in the trash. It was just, I felt terrible for the guy. And again, this is why you typically want the guys you fight, win or lose, to go on to do well. And, an example of the guys you fight going on to do well and it reflecting well on you is it is just typically what you see from champions, as generations go on. So, it looks really good for John Jones that he beat Glover Teixeira in his prime, and then, 8 years later, Glover wins the belt. That reflects well on John Jones. That makes Glover one of the best wins on his resume. Whereas, the fact that Alexander Gustafsson kind of peaked with their first fight, and possibly with the Cormier fight, which he also lost, the fact that Gustafsson didn't go on to win the belt later kind of makes Jones's wins over him not look as hot in hindsight. And as compared to the Teixeira win. And another example of a win aging well is, it's several of them, but is Mighty Mouse's defenses. Many of those have aged well. I made a whole video about him and why his resume is underrated, why his challengers are underrated. I'm gonna rehash that in depth when I make an updated GOAT list video at the start of 2026. But in any case, I'll just give you one very salient example, which is Tim Elliott beating Kai Asakura. Now, Tim Elliott is arguably the worst title defense on Mighty Mouse's resume. He only got the chance because they had basically run out of people for Mighty Mouse to fight, and they did an Ultimate Fighter season where they took flyweight champions from different promotions, different regional promotions all around the world. They brought them all in. They had a tournament. The winner got to fight Mighty Mouse. And the winner was Tim Elliott. So boom, he fights Tim Elliott and wins. And it's an underwhelming challenger to have on his resume. However, a decade later, Tim Elliott's out here smashing Kai Asakura, who is one of Pantoja's title defenses. So it's that looks really good for Mighty Mouse. That makes him and his era look really good. And so again, typically what you'd want if you were Usman is the guy who beat you, Edwards, and the guy who beat him and who is from the same generation, Bilal. You want those guys to go on and do well. You want them, when they fight the Bradys, the Prochases, and the Garys of the world, you want them to smash those guys and send them to the back of the line because it makes you and your era look really good. And if Usman had not beaten Buckley, that's what he would have wanted. But since he did beat Buckley, this is the best case scenario for him because he outlasts Edwards and he outlasts Bilal. And that adds to his greatness because they're great fighters. Edwards had a huge win streak. Edwards had multiple defenses. Edwards, it's easy to kick a guy while he's down now that he's on this losing streak. But Edwards is a great welterweight. And to have Usman just be yeah, well, you know what? You might have won the trilogy with me and I might have aged out, at a point where you could come over and take my belt. But ultimately, I win. Big picture, you won the battle, I won the war. I've outlasted you. That's what Usman can say. And to have the same thing be true for Bilal only cements that. And it reminds me of a thing that didn't actually happen, but seemed like it might have happened. And by that, I mean, I remember when Max Holloway was scheduled to fight Ilia Topuria. Now, of course, we all know Ilia won. He knocked out Max. And I think Ilia was the small favorite going into that fight. And I think a lot of people ultimately, kind of picked him to win, but several people picked Max, and several people were, if they didn't pick Max, they at least thought he had a very good chance. And, because remember, Max was coming off of that knockout of Justin Gaethje at UFC 300, so he was looking very good. And I remember talking to a buddy of mine before that fight, before Max's fight with Ilya, and I was saying to him how if Max can win, if Max can beat this young guy who just took out Volk, in some ways that makes Max the better guy than Volk, even though Max is 0-3 against him. And, granted, like 2 of those 3 were pretty close, but the third one was so decisively clear for Volk that, it sort of put the discussion to rest. But if you can be in Max's spot, though, where you're this young fighter, you come to the UFC, you have this huge win streak, you win the belt, you have several defenses, and then, Volk comes along, you can't beat him, you get 3 cracks at it, just can't do it. But in between those shots, you're taking out these other top contenders. You're fighting Cater, you're fighting Yair Rodriguez, you're fighting Arnold Allen, and you're beating these guys. You're in that sort of Nogueira spot where, you're second to Fedor, but you're still taking out all these top contenders, but you just can't beat the champ. You're in that kind of spot. But if you can be in that spot and then outlast the guy, where Volk loses to Ilya and then you take Ilya out, and you can just look at Volk and be like, yeah, well, I'm still here and you're not. So in some ways that counts for more than the fact that I couldn't beat you specifically, because now my whole, my entire legacy is going to add up to more than yours will. And that would still be debatable, and you would see people debating. If that had played out that way, you would still see people debating who's the featherweight GOAT and, who should be higher on the GOAT list overall, Max or Volk. But Max would have an argument. If he can outlast Volk, if he can beat the guy that beats Volk, he'd have an argument. That didn't play out, like I said, but it was looking like that could have played out. And for Usman, that just is what has happened, basically. I mean, he didn't beat the guy who... He didn't do the same specific thing. It's not like Edwards lost to Belal and then Usman came back and took the belt from Belal or something. But nevertheless, he has outlasted these dudes. And sure, you could maybe argue that he had the easiest assignment. You could argue that Buckley is an easier fight than Praches or Gary. But part of the reason you'd argue that is simply because Usman smashed Buckley and made pretty easy work of him. And Edwards and Belal failed. If that Buckley fight just never happened, if Buckley had just been sitting out this whole time and was still on his win streak, people would still be throwing him out as possibly the top contender at welterweight. And this guy who, we can't give Gary the shot because, what about Buckley? Buckley needs to fight one of these dudes. Buckley had some pretty serious champions who were really fucking blowing smoke up his ass prior to losing to Usman. Some pretty... Yeah, there were some prominent MMA channels, I won't name names, but there were some prominent MMA channels who were, singing his praises, who were liking his chances of being a top contender and maybe winning a belt. And that's all been silenced now that Usman just fucking wrestle-fucked him for 5 rounds. But, although, Buckley came back at the end of the fight, but it didn't amount to much. But, so I think it's a bit of a... To write Buckley off compared to the others, is a little unfair because, that's just Usman's own good work fucking him over. It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't. But I think the more fair and more honest reflection will be to say that, yes, Usman has outlasted these guys. Usman, despite being older, has outlasted both Edwards and Belal. And his loss to Chimaev, which, could arguably be a draw, has only aged magnificently because it was on short notice, it was up a weight class, and, Chimaev went on to smash both Whitaker and Dricus and appears to be, unstoppable as the middleweight champion. So, this is all great for Usman, and Usman could just retire now and just enjoy a very comfortable... little post title loss boost to his legacy. I had him, I think, at number 13 on my GOAT list, in that video I made over the summer. I'd have to check. I think I had him at 13. And if he hadn't come back and beat Buckley, he wouldn't have been that high. He might not have been top 20 at all. But that win over Buckley did wonders for him. And now that Bilal and Edwards have lost too, it does even better, I think. And that's all I'm getting at. Like, we'll see what happens with Usman. We'll see what fights he can get. You know, he might be the kind of guy where he's like, well, I mean, if I can get a title shot, I'll take it, but I'm not going to just fight another contender. You know, maybe he does fight another contender. Maybe he loses. Maybe he wins. You know, we'll see. But as it currently stands, you know, he's in a great spot. And again, it's just remarkable to me because his legacy is being helped in a way that you just never see. It runs contrary to the norm. And you'd have to think of like hypotheticals, like, yeah, what if Max had beaten Ilya? Or what if Nogueira had like won the UFC championship after Fedor started losing? Or, you know, you have to like look at things like that to you know, these hypotheticals to even find a good counterexample, or not a good counterexample, but a good parallel. And to my memory, there just aren't any. And so I thought this was worth making a video about. I think this is a very, very unique case. And it's cool because I like Usman, and Usman is, you know, the clear second best welterweight of all time. He is one of the GOATs, I think. Again, I had him top 15, and, you know, it's looking good for him. So that's all I got.